Okay, so here's my lecture on modernism and James Joyce. Um, I had added all these fancy transitions and stuff into the slide, but apparently I can't record and do that at the same time since Alec wants to see my face. So here we go. It's really important that you guys pay attention and take notes on this for a couple of reasons. One, like I said in class, modernism is going to be sort of the basis for most of the stuff we do for the rest of the year. In the next 3 weeks, everything we're doing is modernism. The poetry we're reading, the short stories we're reading, all of it's modern. So if you don't have a good understanding of it, it's going to be difficult. I think that modernism is probably the most difficult um, time period to really study and understand. So it's important you pay attention. Also, the biography stuff with James Joyce, I know usually we go into it and we talk about an author's life and things they experienced and all that, and that sometimes it seems irrelevant after that. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is in large part based on James Joyce's biography and life. So if you don't have a good understanding of where he's coming from and what was going on with him, then it'll be more difficult for you to follow the novel. So first thing we'll talk about is modernism, which we've discussed a little bit already. It started around 1900. You can trace it back earlier than that, depending on who you really want to attribute it to. But 1900 is a good starting place for us. When it ended is debatable. A lot of people will say that it ended after World War II. Some people say that it didn't end until the late 60s, but it's somewhere in that 20-year span. It's characterized by a break with traditional forms. So the one thing that'll be consistent for modern art and literature and music is that they're trying to do things differently than were done before. Modernism is basically a response to realism and Victorian ideals and Romanticism and all that stuff that came in the 19th century. Modern authors and artists are trying to reject all that stuff. T.S. Eliot, in particular, was big on this idea of sort of rejecting the Victorian and rejecting all of that and coming up with a new method, a new way of doing things, a new um, style. And I know we've looked at Picasso before. This painting is called the Weeping Woman. It's a painting of his from 1937. But you can see there already that um, it's a rejection of the way art used to be, right? It doesn't have that sort of classic landscape and everything's painted accurately. Instead, he's totally reinterpreted how you would do a portrait of somebody. And that's a really great example of modern art. And modern literature is very much the same way. Um, One thing that's really interesting to think about with modernism as a literary movement is that really the big period that comes before it is realism and naturalism a little bit, but that was relatively small. But realism is more or less trying to depict things in a realistic manner. It's trying to portray life and portray situations in a way that seems realistic. Well, at the end of the 19th century, George Kodak comes around. He invents the camera, and people start. He doesn't invent the camera, but he invents sort of a more portable version of the camera, I guess. So all of a sudden, you don't really need to have somebody write about what life is like on the Mississippi. You can take a picture of it, and it'll say the same sort of thing. So realism as a literary genre isn't really as necessary anymore. So that probably had some effect too on people wanting to come up with a new expression, a new style, a new way of doing things. As most of you know, even though modernism starts around 1900, by the time we get to 1914 and start World War I, that really kind of fuels on people even more, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. One more date that might be important just to have in your mind is 1913. That was when the Armory Show was touring America, and that's when a lot of this modern art first started to be exposed to the public. So that was kind of when it really, I guess, started to spread. More modernism. One cool thing about modernism is that it's pretty consistent from England to America, at least in terms of the styles and what people were doing. It also helps that some authors sort of had dual citizenship. I mean, T.S. Eliot was born in Missouri, but he ended up being an English citizen, and W.H. Auden became a U.S. citizen, and Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, all Americans, but they spent a ton of time in Europe. So there was really a whole lot of, I guess, mixing of people. Regardless, the styles are pretty consistent. If you've read Virginia Woolf, who is British, she sounds a lot like James Joyce in terms of her style, but they also kind of resemble Faulkner in a lot of ways, who is obviously American. So a lot of overlap there. There's pretty much always a sense of disillusionment with set morality and standards. So this is one thing where World War One really kind of influences modernism, that people started to look at the world and look at sort of this set of values, this morality, this religion, the things that people were saying you needed to do and needed to follow. And World War One comes in and is the most violent, deadly thing that anybody's ever seen. So people really kind of start to reject that, and you get things like The Wasteland from T.S. Eliot, where people are really just sort of lamenting or questioning any sort of morality that's going on. Ernest Hemingway did this a lot. He responds mostly to World War One, or to wars in general, maybe is a better way to say that. There's also a sense of high art. So one thing that's really interesting about the modern period is that in the 19th century, more and more people became literate. As more people become literate, more people want things to read. They want to be exposed to more art. They want to just learn more. Well, that meant that there was just a great public demand for people writing things, people creating art. So there becomes this sense of high art, that artists wanted to do things that were better than just what the public wanted, or that were more intellectual than what the public wanted. The public wanted Hunger Games and Stephen King and all that stuff. So some of the artists said, we're not going to write stuff like that because it's sort of lowbrow. We're going to create more art. So you get this sense of high art. It's kind of almost more of an art for the upper classes. As a result, that kind of leads to some sense of isolation. A lot of the modernists, either correctly or incorrectly, viewed themselves as, sort of the, I guess, tortured artist who sits alone in their room, painstakingly working on their masterpiece or their portrait or their great novel or anything like that. So they really kind of saw art as a solution to that moral conundrum that World War One brings about, and sort of the rejection of all the ideals from the 19th century. Art somehow becomes sort of the most supreme piece and all that. And by art, I don't just mean like paintings and sketches and all that. I mean, poetry and books and literature and all those things. So as a result, a lot of times you'll see in modernism this sense of isolation. People are often alone in rooms or places. Henry James wrote a story called The Great Good Place, where he's essentially alone in this place. And the reason for that is that artists kind of had this retreat of sort of a room or an isolated area where they could work. And we'll read, I haven't decided all the short stories we're going to read. We'll probably read a story called Paul's Case that kind of shows this, this idea here. So literary modernism. Literary modernism was really my focus of study when I was working on my degree at State. So I love literary modernism. I think it's, in a lot of ways, the most fun period to study, and that's one reason we're going to spend the next few months studying it. But some common things that in literary modernism, there's stream of consciousness. James Joyce uses that a lot, so you'll hopefully have to get used to it. You're not hopefully going to have to get used to it. You will have to get used to it. Faulkner uses stream of consciousness some. So if you read As I Lay Dying as your independent novel, you might already have a little bit of an exposure to that. and Virginia Woolf uses it a ton. So if you've ever read To the Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway or anything that she's written, you've already been exposed to it a little bit. There's also some fragmentation there. A lot of times things don't seem to be connected fully. Hemingway wrote a book called In Our Time, and In Our Time has these short little chapters, and then it has even shorter, sort of, I guess, vignettes um, that don't really have clear connections. So he has these things in between that are called chapters. Even though that's not really a chapter, that's really short, but you can see how that's kind of fragmented. And then he'll have these longer stories like this. This one's ironically called A Very Short Story. But it seems fragmented. That chapter there doesn't really seem to have any sort of clear connection to this part. Again, if you read As I Lay Dying, it seems fragmented in a lot of ways because you're getting so many different characters' perspectives. Even in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the scenes seem to change pretty quickly, and sometimes you don't really know how you got from point A to point B. So it seems fragmented. It's really not as fragmented as they may want you to think, but it does appear that way. There's also internal conflict, decision, thoughts. That kind of comes about from stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness, again, is just a character sort of telling their thoughts, telling their ideas. So there's not as much action in modern novels. A lot of times it's just sort of a character's response to whatever's going on. It's kind of what's going on in the main character's head, which is what A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is. It's mostly the main character, Stephen Daedalus's response to the things that are going on around him, even though nothing going on around him is terribly exciting. There's also themes of war, isolation, chaos, loss. Again, a lot of that comes up after World War One. Obviously, you guys have read The Wasteland, so you can see a lot of those themes in The Wasteland, and we'll see some of those in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This painting here is by Vincent van Gogh. It's part of his Olive Trees series. This one's 1889, so it's a little bit, I guess we would call it pre-modern, but you can see that it's still already getting into that modernist feel because those aren't really accurate depictions of trees. And it's not sort of the broad landscape that we're used to seeing with Romantic art or Victorian art.